So it's going, and we're live. We're live. We're actually live. Okay. Well, welcome, Graeme Friedman.
Thank you, Mike. Good to be with you.
What? Well, I've got whiskey here, Graeme. What is that? Looks like milk. What is it?
It's an adult milkshake. It's known as a White Russian. Coffee liqueur, vodka, and milk. Cheers.
Are you going to keep calling it a White Russian, or do you plan to change the name?
Yeah, true. We should call it a White Ukrainian.
Well, that's pretty good. Okay. Well, welcome. Have you Graham's latest book, What the Boy Hears When the Girl Dreams? I've read this. It's a very good book. I enjoyed it. Thank you. Thank you, Graeme. Thoroughly enjoyed it. We'll get back to it. So let's talk a little bit about yourself. I know you were born and raised in Cape Town, and you were very active in the apartheid era in there. So just tell us a little bit about your background there.
Sure. So yes, I was born and raised in Cape Town in a little outlying suburb called Muizenberg, which you might know well.
It's a good surfing spot, yes. Yeah.
That's right. It's a great surfing spot. It's a bit more of a village than anything else. And yes, I grew up during the apartheid era, and of course, as everyone knows, it was a really terrible regime who treated the majority of the population horrendously. And I grew up exposed to some relatively left-wing ideas. My late father was a human rights lawyer, one of the very early human rights lawyers working in the early 60s. So he defended people who'd been caught up in the pass laws, which were, one of the sort of most ubiquitous of the apartheid laws, in which people had to carry passes with them to enable them legally to be in particular areas. And so, the police would conduct raids in the middle of the night. It was the most terrible, humiliating experience for the victims of these raids, because the people, police would just knock on doors, barge into homes. People would be in their beds, in their pajamas or whatnot, and they'd get arrested and beaten up and thrown into vans and so on. So I grew up with that sort of an influence in my home, although my dad died when I was quite young. But then I had an uncle and aunt who
must have been quite a risk for your dad. I mean, I lived in South Africa for a long, long time, and I mean, when people look back on things like the pass laws, they go, they had what? That's like people that when you tell people they won't even believe it. But your dad must have been in a very, let's call it, exposed position, because any human rights lawyer always came under scrutiny from the security police, and if he was one of the first, then he would have been more so.
I think in those years, because this was the 60s I'm talking about.
Okay.
You could, as a lawyer, if you kept yourself to defending people and practicing law, you would be pretty safe from the security police. But if you strayed outside into political activism, something that was much more active. So, for example, my father sort of, defended, he shared the defense of about 40 people in quite a big trial with Albie Sachs. And I don't know if that name's familiar to you.
Yeah, it's familiar.
So Albie was, just for people watching who don't know, he was a human rights lawyer who later became, one of the African National Congress intellectuals, and very active in the struggle. So, someone like him, attracted a lot of attention. Nelson Mandela, of course, who was a lawyer, attracted a lot of attention because of the underground work that they were doing. But I think my dad was fairly safe from that point of view at that time. Later on, when things got even worse in the sort of, 80s, certainly mid 80s to late 80s, just being a lawyer who was defending people, labeled as a terrorist yourself. So that could draw some attention. Yeah. So yeah.
You actually wrote about some of that. How you never went into the law. You
Funny enough, my this aunt and uncle who I mentioned took me on a holiday when I was about 9 or 10 up to Zimbabwe. Well, I think it was Rhodesia still at that stage. And I had Sangoma threw some bones and told me that I was going to become a lawyer, but no, I didn't become a lawyer. I went into psychology, studied psychology, became a clinical psychologist. But then in some senses, I did become a lawyer because I ended up giving evidence, expert psychological evidence in political trials on behalf of freedom fighters, people who'd been caught and tortured or were on trial for various, so-called crimes.
You were kind of following on in your father's footsteps.
Yes. I did.
Okay. But you have written one of your books, Madiba's Boys, was based. I know that was based upon. I mean, must tell the people here that Madiba is another name for. Not another name. What would you call it? For Nelson Mandela.
And it's Nelson Mandela's clan name.
Clan name. That's right. That's the correct word.
Yeah.
So you wrote a book actually called Madiba's Boys.
Correct. I was actually commissioned to write that book by the agent for two South African footballers. One was a black guy, one a white guy, who at that time were captain and vice captain of the national team. Both of them were playing overseas in the English Premier League and doing very well. In fact, Lucas Radebe, became captain of Leeds United, which
who was that? Lucas Radebe.
Radebe, as people
outside
of South Africa. Yes, yeah. So the agent of these two players had the idea to write a joint biography, but through the story, through their growing up stories and their football careers, tell really a political history of South Africa, because it sort of traversed the time from apartheid years through the transition and into the Mandela presidency years. So yes, Madiba's Boys was a great book to write. I got to travel and with these guys and stay with them and go to games with them and training and.
Wow, that was really cool.
Yeah, that was fun.
So what actually led you into writing then?
You're asking a psychologist, so I'm going to give you a psychological answer.
I'll ask the question again. That's what I'm supposed to do, isn't it?
That's right. So my late dad had a very extensive library, and I think just growing up around books and a sense of how much he respected his books. I remember him taking his books down and dusting them, and making sure they weren't getting mold on them and so on. And I think it just there was the early seed of a sense of how the sort of meaning in my home anyway for the written word. And then I guess it's a similar sort of thing. It took me into psychology. Really, it's about a fascination with story. It's really what I do all day. Is when I'm working in my practice, is that I listen to people's stories and work with their stories.
No, you would. So, but it's quite a leap to go from reading a story to writing a story.
Well, yeah. But I guess, where do you, if you have a sort of burning desire to tell a story, it's this, Mike, you're I'm sure it sits inside of you as well. And in any of us who write, is that burning desire just drives you on. And, it doesn't matter how many stories you write, books, short stories or whatever. If it's in you, you need to keep going.
No. I wouldn't disagree with that sentiment. But you write fiction, you write non-fiction, you write poetry. What have I missed?
I'm writing a memoir at the moment. Poetry, not so. Poetry is one thing, to put it bluntly, I suck at. So I'm not a poet. But yes, I mean, it sort of just came about circumstantially because I started off writing fiction and really only wanting to write fiction. I wrote a bunch of short stories and then a novel. And then I got commissioned to write Madiba's Boys, in fact, which took me into the world of biography. And after that, got commissioned to write another biography. So it's sort of, I think I've just gone along with projects either coming to me or, if they came from the outside, somebody getting me interested in writing something or some idea that I had for something, to write some fiction. So that would just, it's almost happened in a way that I've put out a fiction book and then a non-fiction book and then a fiction book. And so that's been really enjoyable to be able to go from one genre.
Do you find, Graeme, do you find that a bit of, it's like a break, is it? Like,
Yeah.
After, do you think after writing fiction where you got a story and then you got to like parts of it you got to make up and work it all together, whereas with non-fiction, it is what it is. You just got to tell it nicely. Or I'm oversimplifying, but do you find it like nice to change the pace, so to speak?
Yeah, exactly. And that's right. That's exactly right. When you're writing fiction, it's all coming out of your imagination, and so it's, in some ways, it feels that much riskier, and because I mean, you might have an idea of where it's going to end up, but you have no idea actually whether it's going to be any good or not. Look, the same goes, I guess, for a non-fiction book. It might be good or might not be good, but the story, and so you have some sense.
At least you already know that it has a beginning and an end.
Exactly. And you're usually you're going to be writing it because it's an interesting story, so you've got that to begin with.
Yeah. It's mainly just to get that particular story. You think it's relevant to actually get that story out into the world.
Correct. And I mean, it's an interesting thing about non-fiction stories is because you can have a really interesting story, but if it's not told well, it's just going to be a boring flop of a book. So and then otherwise, there's how many non-fiction books take some very minute little detail of history and turn them into these fantastic, imaginative explorations of some human experience just through whatever it is, the making of ball bearings or the spice trade or whatever it might be.
But do you find, right, when you write non-fiction and you're sitting at a table or in the bush somewhere and someone telling you a story and you know the story, but you're going to let another person tell the story and they're telling it badly. I'm guilty of this. Do you find it urge to go, stop? I'll tell the story, Do you find that?
I can't say I do because I don't really think of myself as a good oral storyteller. Some people are really good raconteurs, and I prefer to stick to the written word. So, yeah. And also, in my psychology work, I guess you learn to really be, have an ear out for the layers of the stories, no matter how people are telling them. Everybody's got an interesting story and there's something behind there, even if they're not necessarily putting it into words.
That's a good point, is that they're telling you something, but you're looking for like the underlying condition. Okay.
Yeah, that's right. And you're looking for what are they not telling you as well. And which can be the more interesting part too. What is being held back, not just from the listener, but from themselves. There, I guess, we're talking about the unconscious. What is it that sits below each of our levels of awareness and finds its way out in all sorts of ways, including in our body. How do our bodies speak?
Exactly.
What tales do our bodies tell?
We have the same thing here. My wife's a medical doctor, as most of my friends know. So, if somebody walks in with a limp, a limp's just a symptom.
Right.
You work backwards and say, well, maybe his sciatic nerve's pinched or something, you know.
Yeah.
But so tell me, so how do you actually, let's deal with each of your genres in turn. How do you actually, what do you want, what shall we start with? Let's start with the easy one, what I think is the easy one. Let's take your non-fiction one and your biographies.
Right.
How do you go about that process?
Right.
I would see that as being more structured, because
Yes.
you've got a beginning, a middle, and an end already.
Yeah. So of course it depends on how you want to tell it, because sometimes you don't necessarily start at the beginning when in terms of the structure of the book, but in terms of the whole process, it's the research really that I begin with. So that would be, you know, conducting interviews. In one of the books I wrote the Piano War, which was a story about a couple who'd survived the Second World War under very trying circumstances, and in Europe, and who, you know, ended up getting married. It was a sort of a romance story, but really set in the background of the Holocaust. One of the couple was still alive, one wasn't. So I did extensive interviews with the person who was alive, but with their children, you know, and then, you know, went through this treasure trove of letters and tapes and newspaper articles and so on about their story, because that had a very interesting story. And so, you know, lots of research to try and, you know, who was it? I think it was Janet Malcolm who described sort of, you know, the biographer as kind of, you know, something like a jackdaw is, you know, is looking for little gems, sparkly things to pick up. That's what research is, and it's so pleasurable when you find something that's really interesting, and you know, aha, this is going to be the kernel of some chapter or theme in the book. So that's the beginning, really, is to try and explore the story in as much depth as possible, and then
with your work in psychology, when you do the interviews, I guess that must be most helpful.
Yes, absolutely.
In you trying to, you know, go layer. I guess it's like peeling an onion, isn't it? You go layer to peel it all back, you know, until you find out. You're thinking they said something, but you know that doesn't make sense. So you just keep peeling away. You do your interviews for your biographies.
That's right, and I mean I feel very fortunate that I've had that training and that experience, because it's obviously enormously helpful in conducting those interviews. And sometimes it gets tricky because there are things that people don't necessarily want to reveal, and so one has to be, you know, you've got to know. I mean, one has to be sensitive and try to approach it with respect and in an ethical way. But I guess, you know, most biographers would probably say, you know, they came across this piece of information or that piece of information that had to be handled very, very delicately. And maybe that didn't make it into the final product because it was too whatever, you know.
But how do you go about actually putting it all together then? So you got this big box full of interviews and documents and whatever. How do you go, so the biography goes from beginning to end? How do you go about distilling all of that down into like 300 pages? So,
well, it often what I find is that the material will suggest a beginning, and then I'll just start. You know, it's because somebody, you know, told me some story. I mean, if it's a biography, it might be something, you know, that either happened in the present day or maybe happened in the person's childhood. Madiba's Boys, for example, actually I started it in the present because I had visited a hospital with my two subjects, and who were massive heroes at the time. I mean, South Africa had just won the African Nations Cup, and it was in those you know, very rainbow years, as we called them, with President Mandela, lots of hope. And here were these big superstar, you know, football players visiting these children in hospital. and I went along for the visit, and the reaction of the kids was just so magical.
Lucas Rendezvous was huge. Yeah, he was. Yeah.
Yeah,
He was
and
huge.
Mark Fish was the other. I don't know if you
Oh,
remember
Mark
him.
Fish. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, he
Sure,
was the other
yeah.
player.
Yes.
And Mark's a hell of a character, so he is an interesting guy to interview. But yeah, so that's I was so moved by the reaction to the play and the players' reaction to these sick children, some of whom are very, very ill, cancer patients. I remember one child, had to have an amputation of a leg, and and this child was getting up, and because they were dancing. I mean, it was just phenomenal. And so that moved me so much, and I think it suggested something that could come early on in the book. And so that really just gave me a start, and then I moved backwards and forwards in time, really just telling the story of their growing up years, their childhoods, their careers, and against the backdrop of the history of apartheid, really, and the transition.
It would have been, yeah. Would have been, yeah. But tell me, do you go through the same process when you write fiction? I mean, in your work, I mean, obviously you can't use patients' names in your book, but you must have interesting stories, all over the place. And I guess in your practice notes, you basically write a synopsis, I guess you could call it, of a story. Then you put that down. You suddenly find like, this is actually worth telling, this is.
Well, I one of the non-fiction books I wrote was a collaboration with a very good friend of mine, Joanne Fedler, about relationships.
Okay.
And so that what you're saying about the kind of interesting stories that come up, but of course I can't divulge confidentialities. So the way we did the book was to make up sort of characters and relationships which were had little elements of people here and there who I'd worked with, but were completely non-identifiable as anybody in particular, but were inspired by some of the so that was one way of sort of using those stories in a way that really informed the book.
But then how do you come up with a book like this one? Because this is a very, I don't know what category you put this in. It's a literary book. What category?
One editor I showed it to called it a quirky literary novel, and I love that description. and she didn't mean it so complimentarily, because she was saying she didn't think it was all that commercially sort of attractive, because it was from her point of view, she was saying, I'm writing from a 12-year-old boy's point of view, but it really is a book for adults. Well, for 16 plus, but mainly for adults. And so apparently in the publishing world, that's not something one does if one wants to have a commercial hit. But for every rule like that, there's you can come up with.
But do you think it's because of your that you do have a psychology practice, that you can think from other people's perspective like that? Like, I mean, I don't think I couldn't write from the perspective of a 12-year-old boy. I just couldn't do it.
I was helped by the fact that one of my sons was about 12 at the time.
Okay.
I was coaching his football team, and so when I wrote a big chunk of the novel, I was spending a fair bit of time with a bunch of 12-year-olds, and so that helped. But it was a risk for me, as a writer to do it. Initially, I really had my doubts as to whether I could pull it off. And I mean, hopefully, people think I have, but it's part of that. I think that I enjoy about my writing is that it feels like there needs to be some new challenge in every project that I do. And whenever there's some new challenge, there's risk involved, right? Because you haven't really done that before, and so you're not sure whether you can pull it off or not.
But I mean, with your stories, with your experiences, you could have written. I mean, even like people like James Patterson, you know, one of his big stories. You know, there was a guy with he's a cop and he's a psychologist, and he goes off and daring do, as they say. You know? And I'm sure you've seen enough scary experiences to come up with a thing of a character like based upon yourself, you know, you being, you know. How come you never went down that path?
Well, funny you should mention that, because it's one of the paths I'm wondering about for
okay.
So who knows? Watch the space. It may happen.
Okay.
Yeah.
But with this book, just to give other people a feel, other writers, people working, how long did it take you to from getting up to work to do this?
Wow.
I'm just checking the number of pages here. This goes to almost, it goes to over 350 pages. So how long is it from beginning to end?
It's
like on the shelf, you know?
It's a tough question to answer, because I first got the idea for it a long time ago, in 2005, in fact.
Yeah, wow, okay.
And I'd begun to write down some notes, do some research. You know, a few years later, I think I sat down to try and actually begin a manuscript. At the time, I was, working pretty hard in my practice. We hadn't been in Australia all that long, and so I didn't have a lot of time to write. So I had to put it aside. And in fact, I had to come back to the manuscript about 3 or 4 times. I think it was on the 4th time that I actually managed to finish a complete draft of the manuscript.
Oh, wow, okay.
Very hard to say exactly how long. I'd say some of the other books that are written, and this is sort of, let's say, writing, sort of part-time, probably take about 3 years if you concentrate the time.
And what's your writing protocol? What do you do? When do you write, and where do you write?
Where is the easy part. I've got a study at home, and I've got my consulting room at work, and so if I've got time at work, I might do it at work, but mostly it happens at home in my study. The when is the tricky part. So that's really, for a long time, it was whenever I could grab time, early in the morning, or if the rest of my family was busy doing something, I might grab a couple of hours to write then. But as time has gone by, I've managed to sort of structure my week so that I've got at least 3 almost full days to write. And so I'm in my practice.
Three full days.
Almost, yeah. So I sort of half my time I spend in my practice at this point, and half the time writing.
Okay.
I might have 6 or 7 hours in a day. I might do a couple of Zoom sessions. Actually, I'm still doing a couple of some Zoom work in my practice, and then I'll sit down at maybe 10:30, 11, and a cup of coffee, put some nice gentle music on in the background, and try and put some words on the screen.
So you're a night bird then, right? You write better at night. Quiet.
No, not anymore. I don't know about you, Mike, but
I don't do. I write first thing in the morning.
That's when you feel freshest. Yeah. No. For me, I think I hit around 7 o'clock at night, and that's it these days anyway. 15 years ago, I might have been able to write at night, but not anymore. So
what? Sorry, I'm missing it. So what do you say? You write at night or in the morning?
No, during the day. So
during the day.
When I said 10, 11 o'clock, I meant in the morning.
Okay. Well, okay. That's nice. All right. So what are you planning next, Graeme? What do you?
So I've actually just completed a doctorate
Oh,
on.
well done.
Yeah,
Well done.
thank you. It it really came about because I've been wanting to write up some of my experiences about what we were talking about earlier, about my involvement in the political trials during apartheid. And I've tried in various forms to do that over the years, but it's been very difficult. Been very difficult to revisit times that were very traumatic and difficult. And
But
so,
just expand. Difficulty in what way?
well,
You mean to get the words down, or emotionally, or what?
it's revisiting the memories and the times, and I've come to realize that I sort of carried a little bit of my own post-traumatic stress disorder from those years. I mean, we're talking about the involvement that I had was from the mid 80s through to about 92, 93. For those who don't know the history, the transition to a democratic society happened in 1994, but from about 1984, 85, all the way through to about 1992 to 93 were phenomenally violent years in South Africa.
Yeah, I was there then. Yeah.
Right, so you know very well.
I was there since December '74.
Right. Okay, so
4 years ago.
you were there throughout the most
Yeah, yeah.
violent times of the struggle
Yeah.
years.
Yeah.
And so my involvement, firstly, my involvement was more with a group of psychologists and social workers who we were doing things like counseling people who'd been tortured by the security police. We were going into the townships to help with families of people who were sitting on death row because of their political activities. We were sort of trying to help communities who'd been traumatized by the fighting going on in their streets, deaths happening to family members. So it was very, very difficult exposure to very, very violent things. And then in the political trials themselves, I was working with people who themselves had been tremendously traumatized, had been in survivors of the South African Army, cross-border raids into Lesotho or Swaziland or Mozambique, in which, and this, some of this was known to the public at the time. Much of it was suppressed, but there were terrible things going on, and so working with these people and getting some pretty scary attention from the security police myself. I think when things changed politically, I just wanted to put it behind me, and I just like a lot of us, I think everybody was sort of tired of the violence and only too pleased to try to get on with normal lives.
Yeah, I think only if you knew people who were youngsters in particular, who were in the military or in the police, did you actually hear what was actually happening on the ground. Forget about what was in the newspapers. If you had like family members who were like in the military or the police. I mean, not many people know that South Africa was involved in basically a war in Southwest Africa.
That's right.
Or that they were sitting on the edge of Luanda waiting for Chester Crocker to tell them whether they'll go in or not.
Yeah.
And then they said they sent in the Cubans. So I mean, there's a lot of stories, but there's a tremendous lot of stories there.
There are a phenomenal amount of stories, and over the last couple of decades, they're beginning to appear in print. So, and a huge proportion of that was not known to, well, certainly white South Africans at the time were kept in the dark. The government was phenomenally successful at censorship and propaganda, so that you wouldn't hear about what was going on, either across the border or internally, and the kind of torture of activists or people suspected of being activists was horrendous. So yeah, I mean, if you were involved, you would get to hear about a lot of things. And you if you recall, it was illegal to accuse security policemen of torture or assassination.
No, of course, yeah. But tell me, how do you? One of the difficulties is that because to the rest of the world, South Africa seems like really far away, and apartheid is like yesterday's news. So how do you write about that to make it relatable to people? Be it fiction or non-fiction. Fiction is like, I think fiction, it's just like, how would you write a fiction book to make it relatable? I mean, in this, there's a woman, she's a Malawian, okay, in your story here, right? So, but yeah, so how do you go about trying to make it relatable so that people can get it? Someone sitting in San Francisco, they read it and can like to get it,
I think that is so much in the character development and in the relationships that you create between your characters. So if you can give them depth, if you can go beyond just making, not only you go beyond a two-dimensional cardboard cutout, go to something that feels like this is a complex human being with their difficulties and their joys and their sorrows and their quirkinesses and their ideas and their fantasies and so on. And if you can slowly build that up in a way that's telling showing the story, showing your character, then it can, grabs people. And it doesn't matter really. I mean, if you think about historical fiction, for example, is very, very popular. And that might be about, somebody who lived in the 14th century, people who we can relate to really as little as we might be able to relate to somebody who lives half a world away in a very different country. So it's I guess that's all in the skill of the character development.
But Graeme, you think that this could be your calling to actually write these stories about what actually happened?
Well, I think, and even in What the Boy Hears When the Girl Dreams, I guess I can't but help tell something of a political story. And part of what I wanted to do in that book was to try to bring the world that I'm in now in Sydney, Australia, together with something of the world of Africa that I know, and kind of give my readers a sense of the way in which so many things we do are connected without us really realizing it. So decisions that might take place in government in Canberra or something will impact something that happens. Well, it does. It impacts something that might happen in Iraq or wherever. And so this particular story really tries to bring together events that occurred, in the past in Southern Africa, with decisions made by Western governments, with the idea of saying, look at what happens if we support, policies that might feel very safe for us living in our safe communities, but are not so safe for people who are at the sharp end of those policies.
And, would you see yourself writing a book? I mean, because here in Australia, right, there was a fair amount of injustices against Aborigines since the time of settlement, the settlers. Have you seen yourself writing a book about that? You've seen injustice in South Africa and what happened there. Have you seen yourself writing a similar book about something? I mean, you got a lot to choose from, and I'm sure you've got probably a lot of Aboriginal patients who maybe have given you insights into stuff. You think, wow, really,
I wouldn't feel qualified to write those stories. And I think that, there are so many good First Nations people's writers coming along and being published who are telling those stories incredibly well. So, you know, for me, a white person to tell that story is not something I would do, which doesn't mean to say that, you know, one shouldn't be able to write about, you know, some indigenous characters, you know, coming into one's story. But in terms of really telling it from sort of the you know, an insider's experience, I think we have to, you know, respect that. That's
So going forward, you think you tend to write going back to your roots and writing about all the stories that actually came out of South Africa?
No, I think the one I'm working on at the moment will probably be it, and afterwards I'm not sure. Maybe it'll be what we were touched on earlier, get into a detective genre or something a little lighter.
Okay, so tell us a bit more about the one you're working on.
So that's the memoir about a particular political trial that I was involved with. It was you may well remember it. It was a case in which some ANC guerrillas had crossed over the border from Zimbabwe and laid landmines on the northern, what was the Northern Transvaal border in South Africa. And some farmers' families got blown up, amongst other people. So it was this very, very big trial because, of course, you know, it was one thing when the victims might have been black, but it was another thing for the apartheid government when the victims were white, especially white Afrikaners. And one of the guys had also ended up killing 2 security policemen, also white Afrikaner security policemen. So it was this massive trial in which, you know, it really was a kind of a microcosm of the, you know, the terrible conflict that was going on in the country at the time. And these guys had been tortured into making confessions, and I was asked to give evidence around that, around torture and around forced confessions. And so it's the story of that trial, but I'm in a way I'm using the trial to talk about conflict and to talk about, you know, what it is that, you know, has people being polarized in these ways, in such a way that, you know, they will go out and start killing other people, which is a universal theme, right? You know, whether we're talking about the civil war in South Africa, we're talking about what's going on in Europe at this time, or what's happening in America with the kind of, you know, polarization of society over there.
I was going to come in on that because, I mean, most people I knew in South Africa, white South Africans, had a gun. So, yeah. I mean, I confess I had one. And a hunting rifle, but that was a hunting rifle. But anyway, and with the Americans, with their gun control rules, you know, there's a lot of comparisons you can, I guess you can start to bring into your stories.
Well, that's right, you know, and that's the thing. It's not. I think if you tell a local story well enough, people will be able to see their own parts, at least parts of themselves, parts of their societies in those stories. So the kind of racism that was going on in South Africa is no different, really, at its heart to the racism that might happen in America.
No, I would agree with that. I agree totally with that. Yeah. The fact that, yeah, exactly. No, I agree. Well, this has been fascinating. It's been wonderful talking to you. I could carry on for quite a while. Anyway,
Mike.
I wish you well in your endeavors.
Thank you very much, and thank you for a great chat.
Okay, wonderful. Cheers, Graeme.
Okay, bye.
Okay, dokes.